Thank you very much, Judith, and good afternoon, everyone. This is a slightly frightening experience, I must say, partly because Judith has now built me up in a way that I don't deserve, but also because I'm here amongst people I've worked with, people I've worked for, and worst of all, someone who worked with me but also taught me as well. I think Tony Venables is here somewhere as well, so it's very, very frightening indeed. But I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much to Nick and everyone else who invited me to speak on this very significant anniversary. 10 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, the Stern Review defined the task at hand with what I would say was a crystal clear sentence right at the start of the review. It read, "The scientific evidence is now overwhelming. Climate change presents very serious global risks and it demands an urgent response." Most crucially, the review outlined the economic impacts of climate change and emphasised what are without doubt some very complex challenges of managing the transition to a low-carbon economy. It's indeed a double, maybe even a triple, actually, privilege and pleasure to address you a decade further on. First of all, because of the fundamental importance of the topic, which brings us together today. Climate change is, of course, I think, the ultimate challenge for our time. We're all well aware of the way the review enhanced our understanding of it and focused our attention on the need for action. The second reason for me is because the EBRD has transition at the very core of its mandate. That includes transition to a low-carbon economy. And third, because Nick is a close friend, personally, but also a close friend of the EBRD's, and had a huge influence on the bank that I now am president of, during his time there as chief economist. So today, I intend to look at three core challenges arising from the Stern Review and outline how the multilateral development banks can address them. I'm going to be basing my remarks in particular on the broad experience of sustainable infrastructure financing that's been gained by the EBRD in the last 10 years since the report was published. And the three challenges I'm going to be focusing on are scale, reach, and urgency. Scale because of the sheer size of the climate change challenge, which is literally global. Reach because addressing that scale of that challenge requires a broad and much more inclusive approach involving all countries across all sectors of the economy. And urgency because, to be brutally frank, time is not on our side. Let me start with scale. The numbers, I think, are pretty well known by now, particularly from the work of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, with Nick as its co-chair. Infrastructure investment, the requirement over the next 15 years is in the region of $90 trillion. The Global South accounts for about 2/3 of world infrastructure investment needs at around $4 trillion a year. The shift to low-carbon infrastructure would increase investment needs by as little as 5%, with much higher capital costs potentially fully offset by lower operating expenses. Now, the current annual infrastructure investment is running at a little over half the estimated requirements, with the gap being much higher in a large number of countries, particularly in poorer developing ones. Now, of course, dependency on public finance is, of course, very, very high in developing countries, at around 60% of infrastructure investment. In advanced economies, the relative breakdown is actually reversed, with the private sector accounting for 60%. Now, given all of that, the $100 billion a year for climate finance that was agreed at the Copenhagen conference looks actually quite modest. Now, to achieve scale, climate action does need to have broad reach across geographies, across sectors, across instruments, and financing sources. And the multilateral development banks, the MDBs for short, are really well placed to deliver that reach. And I'm going to say quite a bit about how the MDBs can and must deliver on that reach. I start with the view that climate action needs to impact all countries, whether developed, developing, or emerging. Developed countries, because some of them still have some of the world's highest carbon per capita ratios. Developing and emerging economies, because they often confront the double challenge of pursuing economic growth while trying also to contain carbon emissions growth, and in some cases are already facing complex climate adaptation issues. Now, taken together, the MDBs have very wide geographic coverage, including developing countries and emerging economies in particular. For example, the EBRD now works everywhere from advanced transition countries, which are members of the European Union, to small, poorer economies in Central Asia. Climate action also needs to be deployed across all sectors of the economy. And while the focus has been quite often on energy sector decarbonisation, the transport and agricultural sectors also present perhaps some of the most complex challenges. And the work of the Global Commission on Economy and Climate has, I think, neatly structured these themes as energy, cities, and land use. The MDBs also have significant sector knowledge across their countries of operations. And sector knowledge, at the end of the day, is, in my view, a key ingredient of climate action, linking policy, the development of investment and financing plans, and the mobilization of public and private actors in order to deliver real results on the ground. We at the EBRD, we've invested significant resources, for example, in developing a specific range of energy efficiency financing products at the sector level. The sectors involved include industry, energy, municipal infrastructure, buildings, and banking. This has been key in scaling up our energy efficiency activity. Today, that activity accounts for over €2.5 billion per year, about a quarter of our total annual investment. Now, the Stern Review noted the importance of policy for climate action 10 years ago, and this is further emphasised in the latest new climate economy report. And the MDBs, we're absolutely acutely aware of the close link between policy and financing. In fact, in many sustainable infrastructure areas, without such policy activity, there would be, frankly, no projects and therefore no financing. Reflecting that, some MDBs have now developed policy areas linking the implementation of specific climate policies with financing. In the case of the EBRD, our policy work, it really aims to reduce market distortions and open market opportunities, while project work informs policy priorities and formulation. Now, policy work can operate at many levels. At the high level, examples include supporting a government to define its renewable energy framework, or working on enhancing cost recovery in the energy sector. But at a more technical level, it may also include work with central banks to enhance green financing through the banking system, or defining energy efficiency standards in the residential sector. Now, while technical in nature, the importance of this policy work is it can be a very, very powerful driver of new market development. For example, by encouraging the involvement of local commercial banks in sustainable infrastructure financing and setting the basis for the development of a residential energy efficiency market. Now, given the imminent entry into force of the Paris Agreement, a very significant focus is also now being placed on the development of the nationally determined contributions, NDCs in the jargon, and of related sustainable infrastructure project pipelines. And here I want to salute the NDC Invest initiative launched by the Inter-American Development Bank earlier this month. Now, all of us understand, I think, here that by now public funds will not be enough on their own to address the scale of required climate action. Now, we're going to need access to private funds from capital markets, institutional investors, if we're going to have the impact we all want to have. Sustainable infrastructure financing needs, therefore, to operate effectively across both the public and the private sectors, using a broad range of financing instruments. So just as the EBRD focuses on policy, we also devote a hell of a lot of effort to improving the investment climate in the countries where we work, to attract that private sector investment. That's absolutely crucial, in my view. And we've placed special emphasis on developing the private sector component of our own climate finance activity. As a result, over 60% of our cumulative climate finance of 20 billion euros is in the private sector. Now, in general, a lot of work is underway on greening the financial system, seeking to attract ever larger amounts of private finance from capital markets, from pension funds, and the insurance industry. Multilateral development banks, for their part, have been at the forefront of the growth of the green bonds market. Earlier this month, in the run-up to next month's COP22, the EBRD organised an event on the development of green finance in Africa through the banking system with a major Moroccan commercial bank. Now, that conference, the importance of it was it really connected central banks and commercial banking associations in Africa with a sustainable infrastructure practice of individual commercial banks and private entrepreneurs in the region. It was a fantastic way to link sustainable infrastructure policy discussion, but with real action and results on the ground. And you can see a lot of progress from the multilateral development banks on a much broader front than a few years ago. While operating at an international level, MDBs have become flexible enough to do everything from supporting a small $500 residential energy efficiency loan to a family, say in the Kyrgyz Republic, to financing a large supply-side energy efficiency project worth several $100 million. Indeed, using common accounting methodology, the MDBs will have financed together over $130 billion in climate action in developing and emerging economies from 2011 to 2015. In 2015 alone, MDB climate finance reached $25 billion. Including co-financing, if you include that as well, the total climate finance reached more than $80 billion over that period. So in the build-up to last year's COP21, MDBs, I think, rightly set themselves the objective of further increasing their environmental financing activity. And we at the EBRD, we tried to lead the way. We set ourselves the ambitious target of increasing our share of green financing as a proportion of our total annual investment to 40% by 2020. I think those numbers are impressive and the ambition is laudable. But when you compare those numbers to what's needed, they're still quite modest, actually. Moving from billions to hundreds of billions of sustainable infrastructure funding is going to require a much, much broader mobilization of private funding sources, particularly in developing and emerging markets. So besides policy, scaling up such financing is also dependent on a strong pipeline of having very bankable projects. And that's another area we've been very active, having set up an infrastructure project preparation facility to try and accelerate the very development of such a pipeline. So to summarize, we've seen the MDBs can be a powerful driver of sustainable infrastructure financing. Thanks to our country and sector knowledge, our ability to combine financing, policy, and capacity building, our project preparation and implementation experience, and also our ability to develop bankable projects with the private sector. Now, before moving from scale and reach to urgency, there are just a handful of other factors I think we should all be aware of. First of all, the need to develop local currency financing capacity, given that the revenue base of a significant portion of infrastructure generates local currency flows. That's particularly challenging in many developing countries. The related need to develop local capital markets to provide this local currency, which is why, since the end of the financial crisis, EBRD launched a program to develop local capital markets in the very countries where we work and increase the share of our own financing in local currency. Last year alone, EBRD financed 25% of its debt operations in local currency. That's way higher than any other MDB, and I'd really encourage other MDBs to come to that party. The need also for a sharp focus on financial management and cost recovery at project level. This is key to the financial soundness of projects, to their ability to attract private sector financing and to fund maintenance and operations once assets are built. And one fundamental issue that we really mustn't lose sight of is the way environmental externalities have been internalized in so limited a way. That's particularly true, of course, of the energy sector. It's even truer of the water sector. And it's no accident that Nick has described this as the largest market failure the world has ever seen. And in the real world, this means, of course, that concessional funding will remain an important component of sustainable infrastructure development, wherever and whenever price signals remain weak and the policy context remains deficient. And in this respect, I really hope that the recent appointment of the new executive director of the Green Climate Fund Secretariat is going to allow the GCF to become an even more important contributor to sustainable infrastructure financing. Now, finally, 10 years ago, the Stern Review instilled an acute sense of urgency about the challenges we face. And a decade further on, that urgency has become, well, that much more urgent. Nick's latest book has the poignant title, Why Are We Waiting? It sets out, and I quote, to show that the case for urgent and radical action is extremely strong, and the tools to make it happen are firmly within our grasp. Decades since the Stern Review launch seems actually both a long and a short time. Long if you consider all that's happened since, major financial crisis, Copenhagen, the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the brand new deal now to phase out HFCs, just to mention a few of the major recent events. But quite short, actually, if you consider the urgency of achieving a sharp inflection of carbon emissions. Remember the sentence in the Stern Review: the earlier effective action is taken, the less costly it will be. Now, saving our climate is a question of scale and timing. We need to work much, much harder if we're to make a significant reduction in carbon emissions by the time we meet again to mark the review's 20th anniversary. In closing, let me just express my personal appreciation to Nick for all his inspiration and contribution to the EBRD's climate action, but to all of us globally. I think it's no coincidence, I feel, that the publication of the Stern Review coincided with the launch of the EBRD's own Sustainable Energy Initiative back in 2006. And 10 years on, we at the EBRD, we're resolved more than ever to deliver on the sustainable infrastructure financing imperative. In the case of the EBRD, I can assure you that, to paraphrase the title of Nick's latest book, we're definitely not waiting. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for keeping so strictly to time, that we certainly do have time for one round, although I know Suma's on a very tight schedule, so it will be just one round of questions. I thought there might be a post-lunch lull, but no questions is ridiculous. Well, I'm going to ask one, all right? And that is, we had a very good talk this morning from Deborah Roberts, right, where she was talking about the local government level. And so for me, an obvious question is, how do you get from what I assume to be your level down to the local government? Because the areas that I've worked in, it's all local government.
Sure. I think our experience is actually quite interesting here. We're one of the few development banks that really goes for sub-sovereign municipal level lending. And we've done that over many, many years. In fact, two of the areas you mentioned, Judith, water supply, sanitation, but district heating, residential, all of these things we've tried to do at municipal level directly, and working directly with local authorities, not necessarily going through the central government or ask them for permission to do so. So where we can do that, where we also don't even ask the central government for a guarantee on many occasions, we will do that. I think it's incredibly important to bring these commercialized principles to bear in the climate change area at local level as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, somebody has woken up, because there's one at the back. Hello. And now we've got one there.
Hi, yeah. Hi, I'm Joseph Videra. I'm part of a new tech incubator called Deep Science Ventures. I was wondering how you would facilitate funding startups, because I feel that they have an innate ability to aggressively push new technologies.
So startup funding.
Yeah, so we've tried through funding of various venture capital funds to do that. I have to say it's been much harder than in some other areas. Partly it is a bit of a regional specific issue. If you look at the ecosystem around startups particularly, our region, which is North Africa, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, if you like, the ecosystem isn't as strong. The links between universities and the startup sector is not as strong as it would be. So in some places we've succeeded. I mean, Poland, Russia before, and now increasingly in Jordan. Jordan actually has quite a good industry for this, good ecosystem for this. But it has been much, much harder to do. It's probably easier in some other geographies than ours.
Okay. And then the gentleman here.
Mike Cole from Planet Hydrogen. Two huge energy infrastructures, not only in Europe but worldwide, are the electric grid and gas pipelines. The electric grid can certainly be adapted to take entirely renewable electricity. The gas pipelines, that's more of a problem. They can't carry natural gas anymore. It's going to have to be hydrogen, if anything. Have you got your ears and eyes open to this possibility, and what are the challenges?
Our ears and eyes are open. I'm not wholly sure of the science of that, but I think we have a very strong energy team, a natural resource team, which looks at not just individual projects, but also how the industry is developing. as well. And we finance a number of these sort of pipeline projects that you've mentioned. So I think our ears are definitely open to ideas, but we can follow up on the detail, if you like, afterwards.
Okay. Now, I think I'm going to call it a day, though, because I know that Suma has got other things that he has to urgently do. Okay? So, thank you very much, and please would you thank Suma for his talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.